Hey, CNFers. If you're looking to get into shape, sometimes you hire a personal trainer, and they help you stay accountable, check your form, etc. Likewise, if your writing needs a boost, needs a form check, that little something in your corner to say, keep going, man, keep going, consider letting me help you out. If you're working on a book, an essay, a query, a proposal, and you're ready to level up, email me at brendan@brendanomeara.com. Hey, and we'll start a dialogue. I'd be honored to help you get where you want to go.
If we're going to do advice from people, let's talk about Coco Chanel. And you always remove one, accessory before you walk out the door.
Well, all right. This is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Meara. How's it going? Today's guest for episode 302 is Neda Toloui-Semnani, author of They Said They Wanted Revolution, a memoir of my parents. It's published by Little A. Here's a little blurbish of the book. From a daughter of Iranian revolutionaries, activists, immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers comes a gripping and emotional memoir of family and the tumultuous history of two nations. Boom. It's a wonderful memoir told with journalistic rigor and tenderness. It's of a genre of memoir that I really love, which I've really come to love, which is more of a quest. The author is not necessarily at the center of the story, though she is the narrator and that, but she's more of a guide, the storyteller. And, she's on a hunt for answers to fill in the gaps. I think of Lily Danziger's Negative Space or David Carr's The Night of the Gun. There's discovery there. It's not navel-gazy. I loved it. And in the middle part of Neda's book is some of the most gripping storytelling you might ever come across. 2 stars. Just kidding. 5 stars. Before that, let's do some housekeeping, CNFers. I want to remind you to keep the conversation going on Twitter at CNFPod or at Creative Nonfiction Podcast on Instagram. You can also support the podcast by becoming a paid member at the Patreon crew, patreon.com/CNFPod/. As I say, the show is free, but it sure as hell ain't cheap. Members get transcripts, chances to ask questions of future guests, which is a lukewarm thing. Maybe I won't even put that out there anymore because it just doesn't seem to be getting any traction. Anyway, special podcasts that are in production. So, fun things. Some coaching, too, depending on your tier. Go window shop. You'll be helping the audio magazine, the writers who get paid as a result of their submissions. It's consider it. Consider supporting the community in that way. I know it's a big ask. We only have so much income at our disposal, so there are free ways to support the show, like leaving a kind review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify. Written reviews for our little podcast that could go a long way toward validating the enterprise for the wayward CNFer sailing by in the night. We got a nice flood of some written reviews. Got like 3 new ones in the last week, which was amazing. And I read one of the new ones last week, and I'll read a new one right now. This one from Tracy in Japan, titled, "Grateful to have found this. Enjoying this podcast, a new find for me, and learning a lot from it. Even after having listened to only a few episodes, I love the blend of discussion about craft, writing as a career, and each author's subject matter. I've been craving more podcasts that are high quality and that discuss technique, and I haven't found quite the right one for me that focuses on just CNF. Until now." That was her, until now. It sounded like I added that, but she said that. You know what's bonkers? And that's an amazing review. Thank you so much, Tracy in Japan. You know what's bonkers is I've been doing the show nearly 10 years, and people still stumble across it, and they're like, holy shit, where was this? Why haven't I heard of this? Fact is, we stumble on things when we're supposed to, and CNF Pod will keep on being there for you to trip over. And a podcast meet cute I hope you'll tell your grandkids about one day. Show notes and my up to 11 monthly newsletter can be found at brendanomeara.com. Hey, once a month, no spam. Last I checked, you can't beat it. Yeah, just saying. A little more about Neda. She's a senior writer with the television news magazine Vice News Tonight. Her work has appeared in numerous publications, including The Washington Post, Kinfolk, New York, LA Review of Books, The Baffler of the Week, BuzzFeed, and Roll Call, among others. Geez, are there more? Whew. She's been featured in The Rumpus and This American Life. She holds a Master's of Science in Gender and Social Policy from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a Master's in Fine Arts and Nonfiction from Goucher College. Where have I heard that before? She was named a 2018 Fellow with the Logan Nonfiction Program and a 2017 NYSCA/NYFA Fellow in Nonfiction. She grew up in Washington, D.C. and is based in Brooklyn, where all the writers are, where she lives with a small dog, a large cat, a chubby baby, and a man she calls Stretch. I should have asked her about that. I remember reading about that. I'm like, what? I should ask her why she calls the man Stretch, and I never did. Oh well, maybe next time. You can find her at NedaSemnani.com or on Twitter at Neda, NEDA _ Semnani, SEMNANI. She has the single greatest Twitter avatar I have ever seen. Anyway, stay tuned for my parting shot at the end of the show. This interview was part of a live Zoomie I did in conjunction with Goucher College's MFA in Nonfiction, and I'm happy to share it with you right now. Wait, now? Oh, Hank is telling me I need to say the magic word. Riff. The best writing advice I ever came across was a very short line by David Finkel. And it was, if reporting is always getting the name of the dog, writing is knowing when not to use the name of the dog. And I love that, and I'm sure that appeals to you on some level as a journalist. But I wonder, if for you, what is some of the best writing advice that you've ever come across? And you can even riff on that Finkel quote.
I actually think that's a great quote. I remember I always think that you should be, I think, the best writing / reporting advice is always show up because that's like 90% of it. You need to kind of, we can do a ton of reporting on the phone and through research and stuff, and, Lord knows that's how I did most of this, did most of the work of this book. But I do think that Finkel's point is beautiful and well taken, that actually you do need to know the name of the dog because it tells you something about the dog and it tells you something about the owners. And then you can kind of build the world around that. The creative part is in the writing, I think. I know that is the creative part, is figuring out how to paint the picture in a way that it comes alive for the reader, for the audience.
Yeah. And especially true too, is you can do all the gathering you want, and you need at some point or another to show some degree of restraint. And that is really hard when you've done a ton of legwork. You've done all this reporting. You've gotten all the names of the dog. But then realizing, okay, is this really necessary? Is this an oar in the boat that's going to row this thing forward? And I think that's really hard. And it's hard to do in early drafts. And it's even sometimes harder to do in later drafts when you really love some of these things that you've worked so hard on.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely, yes. I think ultimately what you're saying is one must edit, which I believe, if we're going to do advice from people, let's talk about Coco Chanel. And you always remove one, accessory before you walk out the door, which is a piece of advice I find sometimes difficult to take when I especially love an earring or something. But I do think actually writing for TV has been the most helpful for knowing when to pare back, because so much of writing for TV, and I'm sure this is true for audio, but I don't write for audio as much. But I think when you're writing like a long form piece or a magazine piece or a feature piece for a newspaper, you do that. Those early drafts are all about dumping everything, and then, or at least my everybody has their way of writing, but mine is I want all the details. And then, like you said, and then it's about going and scaling it back and kind of like, you know, doing it, pulling back, pulling back, pulling back, pulling back. And I think learning how to write on deadline and learning how to write for different media also helps you know what to cut and maybe what you maybe don't feel as precious about some of your darlings.
How have you learned to cultivate or even develop that firewall between the generative writer that needs to get all that stuff down and the editor who's going to come in later and rewrite the heck out of it and maybe even lop off 25% of all that stuff you just did, but in service of the story in the end?
I think there is no better editor than giving yourself time and space. Like, I think people don't do that enough. They don't. I think there's something about, I don't know if it's like a work ethic thing or I don't know what it is, but sometimes I watch writers toil and like really just like sweat over the laptop. And my job as the editor is really to go in and be like, close the laptop, go for a walk. And they, you know, my writers sometimes fight me on that, but I really think there's no way for you to know what you need without space, what you need in the story. Because also you don't have, I guess that's like a long way of saying, this is all a long way of saying, like, you need perspective. That's the firewall, is perspective. And distance and space also checks your ego a bit. You're not so attached to all the words, because then you can come in fresh the next day or an hour later or a week later or, you know, a year later and be like, oh, I understand what I was trying to do. And like, thank you, past writer. That was very, very helpful. But I think you missed the piece, you know, you've been talking about this dog the whole time, but really it's the kid that's been taking care of the dog. That's the story, or vice versa.
And I've been working like hell on a book proposal for a biography, and a lot of the research I'm doing is newspapers.com, and it's a lot of just type something in, get all the results, copy, take pictures, screenshots, all that stuff. And it's all good and it's all going in to the well. But on some level, it kind of feels somewhat lazy. It's just you can type in anything and it finds out, okay, save that. But ultimately, I think this might appeal to you given your journalism background and certainly mine as well, is that the real gold is finding the work and the research that you can't Google. And I wonder if maybe you can speak to the importance of some of that boot leather reporting that you can't Google.
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, speaking of just like what you had said before about like feeling almost guilty about just like putting words into a machine and it spits out. There's something about it that feels like too easy or something.
Like you're cheating in a way.
Like almost like you're cheating. And then you realize that actually you spend a lot of time searching through, like combing information. And that's what gives you the expertise to, as you say, know what to like, you know, cut away, you know. And newspapers.com, I am not sponsored by them, but they are a treasure. Truly. It's amazing what you're able to do. But, you know, what I find that things like microfiche or going to the archives, or because so much of that's online now, or, you know, something like a Ancestry or a newspapers.com, what that does is really help you kind of in aggregate. Like it doesn't necessarily, unless you're like doing a very serious, like investigative piece where you're looking for that one kind of needle in a haystack. What it does is it like helps paint a picture of a period or a time or, you know, an issue, as it were. But the shoe leather then comes in. For example, you know, I did a lot of research in the book about a certain period of time in Berkeley, California. So I had just done like a ton of that type of research that you're talking about, and like a ton of archival research, both the easy and the difficult, you know, easy in quotes and the difficult kind. But I think it made such a difference to be able to go to Berkeley, California, and, you know, not just walk around. I mean, I went back and forth there as a kid, so I was familiar with it. But I had people who were there at that time who were involved in this movement take me around literally street by street. I sat with them in various coffee shops. We drove and drove and drove around the town, and they were able to point out like where the city had changed, or where this was the house where we sat down and we decided to start this group. And then I was able to like pull some of those details, because like when you're recreating something that not only were you not there, but there's not a ton of information about it. There's not a ton of academic literature around it. You're kind of creating something out of air. And so those details, like I remember the house that somebody had showed me was like this, had been redone, and it was like beautifully painted, and it was gray house, and it had these these like fresh red stairs painted. And there was something about that detail that like it felt important to me, because it felt like something that we had been living in the past, in this recreated past. And now I was able to give the reader something to latch onto, a picture in their head where it suddenly grounded them. And I couldn't have done that. I don't think I could have done that without being there, without being like shown around, without spending so much time talking to people about a period of time that, you know, is long gone. No matter how many documentaries you watch, you're never going to know it. You know what I mean? And so,
oh yeah,
how do you find the connections between the present and the past? And I think that's what this type of writing is.
Oh, for sure. And I know for me, and maybe this is true for you too, that when it comes to the research, it you can do all that sort of like archival stuff, newspaper stuff, but it doesn't really start to feel like something uniquely only you can do until you start interviewing the people, and you're like, this is someone I'm in front of, getting information, asking questions through my lens and my taste, and filling up my notebook or my recorder with things that only I have gathered. And at that point, it really starts, at least for me, the fuel tank really starts to fill up, and I'm just like, oh wow, I'm energized by this. And I wonder if maybe you feel that way too.
I mean, I think the best part of our job is the sitting down and being able to lose yourself in somebody else's story, and really like, yeah, you use a phrase, filling up your tank. Like, it's you as the interviewer only matter in so much as you are teasing out information. But whatever day you've had doesn't really matter, because it can't in that moment. The person across from you and the bigger story that you're trying to get to, that relationship is so intimate and it's so special. And it really comes down, there are some really extraordinary interviewers who are out there, you know, someone like Finkel. I think of like Eli Saslow's work, and you can tell the skill of their interviewing because of the beauty of the portraits that they're able to paint from those details that you're able to get, like you said, in those conversations. Because you go into an interview hopefully having prepared, but you know, the dirty secret is actually sometimes you don't have to have prepared. You just have to go in as curious as you possibly can be, and ask and keep asking questions until the person, and that person will, you know, hopefully lead you. I mean, not completely, but like the story comes from that curiosity, I think, and that, and the other person being willing to answer and being giving.
Yeah, and there has to be a certain measure of comfort, especially when you're interviewing for scene, where you have to ask sometimes really inane details that, you know, I'm always like, listen, I'm sorry, like I'm a stickler for detail, but do you remember what you were wearing? Do you remember the sounds of the room? What was smelling? What was the last thing you would cook that day? I don't know. Just things are just coming off the top of my head. And they look at you like, what the hell are you talking about? Why does this matter? And to me, it all matters. And I wonder if maybe you can speak to, you know, that degree of granular interviewing that's building scene, where you have to kind of preface the person, be like, listen, just bear with me as I get these details.
You're nicer than I am. I was going to say, I think the difficulty there is not losing the connection. Because I think, you know, I find the interviews, especially when it's that immersive, really, like, I feel like just exhausted, like depleted, like to my bones exhausted afterwards. I mean, I think it's also like staying connected with somebody that long. I mean, we normally don't do that in our lives. Our brains are going this way and that way and the other way. And then, obviously as a journalist, you're always like, is my recorder working? Am I writing as fast as you can? But especially I find when I really need those details are when this is like a pivotal part of their story. And I know it is. Like, I know this is like a moment of deep, whatever, trauma in some cases or excitement in others. Like, this is a point where the action has to slow down. And so I need them to be able to stay in that moment, go back to that moment. And I need them. And this I think is really difficult, but I need it not to hurt them. I need to make sure that because like you said, that like I always think people don't ask enough about what did it smell like? What was the texture of the air? Because sometimes when you're in that place where, something that's big or something that's critical has happened, your senses kind of heighten in that moment and you don't even realize it. So what you're asking is for it's you can see that in the way that you tell stories. Like if you get in a car accident, you talk about like it's slowing down, the world's slowing down and then speeding up again. So the trick is to try to like get people to stay in that slowness and like focus a bit and not too long because you don't want to hurt anyone. But like what did it smell like? What it was the sound of like, was there a sound of shattering glass? What was like the furthest thing that you can remember? Is there a color that stuck out to you? Do you remember if your teeth chattered? Like those type of things. And just like, I think the trick is for me, because I'm so scared about ruining somebody's day or like accidentally forcing them to have another therapy session that they maybe didn't budget for, that it has to be really super quick. And then you go and then you leave that topic and you kind of come back if you see them, I guess be stronger about it or feel if they're okay about it, then you can linger. But those are, those are the best parts when somebody can remember something like the smell of barbecue on the day their dad left, for example. Then you have an entire scene, you just need a few details. And the best part is you like literally something like that. You have the tone of their voice. You have how they answer your questions. They don't even need to say a whole lot.
Oh, for sure. And with this book that you wrote, now I believe you started essentially the reporting or the research or the idea of it was probably 2013. Is that right? So where are we now in that timeline? 8 to 9 years later. And you talked earlier about, time giving you perspective and time being a friend in the editing process. How did time help you from the inception of this project to where it ultimately got?
I think, that in some ways is, and that's probably, I think it's a good question. I think this book is kind of, most books are, but this book was birthed because it took so long. Like, I think I needed to grow up during the writing of it. There was a lot of reporting that went into it, but there was a lot of my own work that I had to do. I had to figure out how to write this book that didn't really make, when I tried to describe it to people, I didn't have the words for it. So I needed time to kind of wrap my head around the ambition around it. And, the other thing is, I think a memoir, which, this book is a snapshot of a period of time for the author. And, I started this book about 3 years after my mom passed away, and I'm ending it like it's coming out into the world after she's been gone for about 12 years. So I also think the perspective of really like sinking into both grief and then coming out of like that acute grief was really helpful, because this is a book in some ways that is about a grieving. How do you grieve people how do you keep people alive? How do you pay tribute to your ancestors? I mean, that's what I think in some ways journalism is. It's a paying tribute. It's a posterity. It's a record keeping. I find it to be pretty like a sacred undertaking in some ways. So I think I needed to come to that. I wasn't so sanguine about it. I wasn't like a wise woman about it. I was really frustrated and angry for a lot of it, that like, why was it taking so long? Why couldn't I do this faster? Why couldn't I write it faster? Why couldn't I sell it faster? Why was this happening? What was wrong with me? What was wrong with me? But I think I was just thinking about this today. One of my mom's old friends called right before this, and her reaction and several people's reaction to the book has been so moving that it did occur to me today that this book softened over time. It deepened over time because it had the space to work its way out of me. I don't know if that makes sense, but it needed to work its way out of me, and it couldn't be rushed,
How did, and granted this was very far along in the process, but how did becoming a mother yourself inform maybe the final stretch of this book?
I think it informed the framing. I mean, literally it informed the framing. That's how it's framed. But I think because I was finishing the manuscript while I was pregnant, and not only while I was pregnant, during like the protests, the racial justice protests of 2020, during a pandemic, and as I was covering the 2020 election, there was a lot of churn happening. There was a lot of like social and political unrest. There was a lot of history happening. And this is a book that is both informed by history, but it's a meditation on what that means. And then of course, like it's like I said, it's a book about grief. And so it's a book about my parents. So what happens? So I spent a lot of time thinking about, what does it mean now that I am about to become a parent? And I remember one of the climactic parts of the book is we escaped from Iran when my mother was 7 months pregnant when she escaped from Iran with me. And I literally was writing the last scene of the book. It was right after the January 6th insurrection. And I remember my son just moving around in my belly as I'm both covering the insurrection and as I'm writing the last pages. And there was something incredibly profound, and somehow it grounded me. But it just, I don't know that I actually have the words. It felt faded, and I'm not somebody who uses that, it sounds very magical thinking, but it felt somehow faded that it should take that long, because my son needed to be a part of this somehow. It also helped me think through what I meant about the generations being connected, because until my son came into the picture, I was the hard stop. And what Rumi did was continue, like there was a suggestion of a future, another generation after me.
Yeah, when your grandfather or your great grandfather, I think, chose the surname, it essentially put a little clause on the sentence of where you say like when when your grandfather chose it, we began to be what we would become, a clan of wanderers and seekers, determined dreamers moving through a too real world. And I loved hearing that, and I wonder, like, when you think about that and what your grandfather essentially forged, and how Rumi's able to sort of carry that too. What goes through your mind when you're writing that sentence, and then maybe even just hearing it reflected back to you?
I remember writing that. I mean, that scene is, my grandfather when he was quite young, walking from Semnan to Tehran to try to work, and I think he was 13 at the time, to find work. And at the time he had to decide our last name, because there wasn't something that was people had in Iran at that point. One of the things that really struck me about that scene is I think there was something so American in the kind of capital A American myth of Go West Young Man. And in my head, that rhythm of the Go West Young Man was like playing over and over again in my head. And I think some of that cadence comes out. I mean, hopefully that was the the cadence of walking, of moving, that kind of rhythm of like moving forward was part of the prose in that section. But yeah, I mean, for me, that section, one of the things that I tried to tease out was how closely connected the myth of America is with the myth of Iran, and with all of our mythos, you know. So that was a scene that I really, I mean, I was very close to my grandfather. I loved him. I used to say he was my soulmate. So that section felt like such a privilege too, because I got to be with him in my head for a little bit. That's one of my favorites that I can go back to, and I just feel like maybe he is somehow folded into those words, and I get to visit him a bit.
Yeah, of course. And when we had our little pre-chat last week, I was talking to you kind of about this this tool that you're essentially able to use, which is kind of like a journalistic detachment, I think, which allowed you to tell a very personal story of people very dear to you with not a objectivity, but I think some distance that allowed you to tell the story in the truest, rawest way possible. And it goes to a sense, and I love this kind of memoir where the writer is really on a quest of some sort of discovery. I think of Lily Danziger's Negative Space, David Carr's Night of the Gun, and this too, as you're trying to piece together your parents' story. So, how maybe give us a sense of, using that journalistic detachment to tell a personal story. It's still a memoir, but it's not you're not as forward. Your parents are very much forward, and the movement and the time and the scene is the forward. So maybe you can speak to that.
So you cut out a little bit, but I think I got the gist of the question. Like I think being a journalist really, I don't know how people can write memoirs without being a journalist, because it is so, I don't know how people do it. I mean, it's true admiration, because I think the tools of journalism saved me in so many ways. You're right about the, sorry, I live in New York, so of course there's going to be sirens.
That's all right. It's a audio seasoning.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so the tools of journalism like gave me a little bit of distance, and they also, so they saved me. They were able to kind of insulate the core of me during some of the more difficult parts. But they also, I think, they also gave me a false sense of safety in some ways. I spent some time thinking with some of the more difficult sections that, oh, well, I'm a journalist and I know how to hold myself with some distance and I can just like work this scene to death until I get it right. And actually, I would forget that this is something, I wasn't just writing about, your father. I was writing about my own father. And even if I was writing about your father, I would, writing something that can be, that's about somebody dying the way that my father did die, can be very, difficult and harrowing. And it's, so even if I was writing about a stranger, I would do it differently. But it didn't have the experience maybe, and maybe I didn't have the self-awareness to know that that journalism that distance won't save you from being human. Like your heart's gonna break anyway. So you just have to be just exceedingly careful with yourself. But the book is structured where that journalism is really kind of front loaded. I mean, it's woven all through, but it is that distance, that like distant first person is really front loaded. And as the book goes from talking about the years I don't exist when I'm recreating things, the voice, the point of view kind of becomes more and more intimate, and then ultimately more fragmented, because then you're inside of me, as the reader, you're in my brain, you're with me. And it becomes harder to tell a linear story when you get too close,
For sure.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and speaking of the structure of the book, like you front loaded with a lot of the context of the geopolitical context of which your parents sort of parachute into, and then the big middle chunk is this really harrowing recreation of the escape from Iran, and in the third chunk is a lot of emails and journal entries and everything. So I was wondering, maybe you can just walk us through how you went about structuring this book to tell it in that manner, and with special attention to that middle section, because that was a really harrowing and gripping writing and reading for that escape. So that was amazing stuff.
Oh, thank you. That middle section took about 4 years, I think, to get down. It started with, I'm going to start with that part of your question, because I think that section was, I wrote it while I was actually at Goucher. I wrote the first draft. And it was, I had been given a recording of my mother, a long recording, like 8 hours or something, where she went into detail about it. So the first thing I did was transcribe that and kind of just like try to get my head around her version. And then she's the only person that had passed away at that point. Everybody else is still alive who was involved, of my family who was involved. So I was able to, what I then did was essentially go through each person's version of what happened, version of events. And then that was the first version, was just doing that, was like figuring out where things overlapped. It took me a long time, maybe 2 years, to figure out, because everybody's memories were just different enough. I couldn't get a timeline. But this goes back to what you were saying before about knowing what details to leave in and which ones to take out. I find when something is meant to be propulsive, when it's supposed to really grab you, actually then you want the writing to slow down. You don't want to give people too many details, because their brains will pick up where you left off. And I remember I figured this out when I was reading C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. In my head, it was this whole different thing. But when you go back to read it, the writing was so spare, actually, and there wasn't a ton of details. My brain had filled everything out. So I really took that as a model. And I remember anytime the sentences got too long in that middle section, I would cut them in half. And I just kind of went over it and over it and over it. A couple of years later, my aunt found a diary of hers that she had written right after the escape. And that had like a ton of details. And then my brother had taken a bunch of videos from the last year of my mother's life. And in one of those, the family had come together for Thanksgiving. I think it was Thanksgiving. And everybody who was in the escape sat around and talked about it. And so I went through and teased out some of those details. And so that section was really about, like you said, filling it up with detail, but then just going through it over and over and over and over until there was almost that there was, so then your brain would like latch on when I said a boxy red sedan or something about the car, because that is the only thing that you had to kind of grab onto.
Yeah, and then there's the very short sections that you write in, which are probably during that, which I found pretty propulsive and like bite-sized, but also just animated with the energy of the page break. Also, because those sections might be, I don't know, 300 or 400 words at a crack, and it's just like one toe hold, one hand hold, and here we go as you advance this really, this harrowing quest, really, and journey to get out of the country. Was that something on your mind too, that you wanted to have it, these bite-sized elements of blocks, almost like story blocks as we advance?
Yeah. I mean, I think how you said it about like the handhold, I wanted the reader to feel like they were essentially like, moving themselves through the story. I mean, It's you had asked about how I structured it before, and honestly, this is one of those books that I don't know. I don't know how I could have done it outside of just like rearranging the pieces until they fit. You know what I mean? Like, it was a real moving each fragment around. It wasn't, obviously, I don't think it reads like it was sitting down and writing it start to finish. It was each section almost each section I wrote differently, and then smoothed it, I don't know if it worked, but like smoothed it out in the editing process. And the hope is that it feels almost like a Russian doll, that the layers you peel away are not maybe an onion structure, more that you like peel away one layer and then the next layer and then the next layer. But yeah, I knew it had to be 3 sections. I knew that. I knew it had to be before my parents. It had to be when they met to the revolution. Then it had to be them going back to Iran. And then, so it had to be 79 to the escape, which was 82. And then the real question mark for me was what happens when we get back? What happens when we come back to the States? How do I tell the story of my life, like my personal life, in a way that, feels accurate and is something that I could actually do, but also felt true to the story, I guess.
Yeah, and there's a moment too where, talking about breaking up that whole part too, like there's a long section of many sections of that journey, and then you get a lot of those details from your uncle who, came over and really facilitated matters for everybody. And then, you break in at one point and you're just like, thanks for getting us out of there, D, who you referred in the book. And then it's just kind of like back to that. It was just kind of a nice little like hat tip and a little way of that we break out of the narrative that you were telling to come to the current day, but then we're kind of like back into it. It was like, I don't know, like what as a creative decision, like how did that pop into your head?
That's a good question, because it felt so important. I think a lot of this book is also me acknowledging how many people we are. All of us rely on people, right, to like help facilitate whatever's happening in our lives. And in this case, my uncle had to come over, and he put himself at risk for us to be safe. And he, one of the things that really, and the story is obviously, I scaled it down to, because it could be an entire book on itself, I think. And then, my aunt and uncle who were stuck in Turkey, they have a whole other, harrowing story that happened to get them out of Turkey. So I think I wanted to just, first of all, I wanted to remind people that this is stories that people are telling me, that I haven't made these wholesale, but also that this is a story of a family. And part of that is like the comfort and the intimacy of staying up late into the night with your uncle, and then stepping back and being like, thanks for coming to get me. Like,
Right.
like you're my uncle. Like, thank you. And, because it's in some ways, the everyday things that we do for each other. And we spend a lot of time, especially as journalists, harping on all the bad things we do to each other. And we should. But I do think sometimes it's nice to step out and be like, yeah, thank your people, man.
But speaking of your uncle, and speaking of the journalistic rigor that you exercise in this, like there's a moment too where you're sort of at the border, I believe, in Turkey. You're looking to get on an airplane, I think, and your aunt has a very forged passport. Your mother remembers your brother being very goofy and being like, he's being goofy, like, focus, would you? But so that's her point of view. But what really was going on was he was trying to create a distraction because that passport that your aunt had was so fake what, just to get her to Spain, or I think that's where she needed to go. So it was just like the fact that you're interviewing these different people, you get all those different perspectives that, oh, this is how one person saw it, but this is how it really was going on. I thought that was just really, just really good legwork on your part.
I felt like that was really important for me, because when my mother had told that story, it sounded painful to her, and I remember like feeling like it was actually kind of like a beautiful, symbolic moment. And I could see how that would play, and it would be kind of like devastating and sad. And then when I asked my uncle about it and he remembered it so clearly, it changed. I mean, this goes back to what you were asking, like, how does the leg work? How does the gumshoe reporting change? How does asking questions change it? All of a sudden, it made it so much more interesting to me that it like brought all these textures. This was an emergency situation. Everyone's like just trying to figure out how to survive, to survive, literally. How do you escape? How do you leave this one country and then get to a place where you're safe? And we are all, I say this in the book over and over again, we only have a certain amount of information, each one of us. And so, so that just seemed like to me to be like this perfect moment where you can be standing right next to somebody having the exact same, the exact same moment. You're living through the exact same moment, and your understanding of it is just so different. Like it's night and day. And at the same time, there is so much love there, like that there's just like this, it's just like a rich tapestry of what it means to be family and human in that moment.
Yeah, and there's a moment too early in the book, and then you echo it much later, where knowing the world that your parents were from and that you were born into, you ask, if he, meaning your father, knew this was what was going to happen, why did he decide to have a family? And that really broke you down and broke your heart at this moment in the book. And then you ask yourself that same question at the very end of the book too, in the world that you've started a family in. So how is that question ping ponged in your head from your parents to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is when you asked earlier, what has becoming a parent, how has that changed the book? I mean, even you asking that question, like, made me want to just put my head down and weep. I don't know. I mean, I remember when Joy told me that story about my father being so determined and so sure that he was going to go back to Iran, and like, he was a revolutionary, and who knows if he was going to make it. And I can just see like so many young, like it's like the pinnacle of the young kind of idealistic woman, going to change the world come what may. And then of course, 10 years later or something, he has a kid. And, I know what that means. 10 years after you say one thing to be, an adult, and you have a different kind of adult, you have a whole different, span of events behind you and understanding of the world. And life is both less complicated and more complicated than you thought it was going to be. And then here I am. Like, I don't know how to reconcile the choice of, I have this beautiful baby who just seems to have so much fun being alive. And my heart kind of breaks because I know the world that we all live in, I mean, specifically in this moment with like the political divisions and climate change and, the rise of authoritarianism and the pandemic, and my heart just, I don't know. So to answer it, but I don't know. I mean, part of me also has hope. It's so dumb, but I have so much hope still. And I think that's, whenever I think about it, I think, well, he's not wrong to love being alive. It's a beautiful thing. And And we need good people to make sure we survive.
There was a part in the book, later in the book, where you write, "This way of coping, exploring, and indulging my curiosities has never left me. It's a fundamental part of who I am and how I navigate my world. It's why I'm the person I am. It's why I am a writer." And maybe in there is a little nugget of your writer origin story. So maybe you can just kind of give us a glimpse as to, that coping, exploring, indulging curiosities, that core of you that made you become a writer. So how did you lean into this mess that we're all in?
So one of the things, going back to an earlier question you asked, like, how did time change this book? I think, going back to having perspective, I realized, I was telling the story of, this is when I was trying to write the story of my relationship with my father, which I can only know only in pieces. And one of the things that really struck me was my dad spent so much time telling me stories, helping me tell stories. Like, he would make these cartoons and we would tell these stories. This is what I've heard, tell these stories together. But I remember that. I remember the cartoons. I remember how important they were to me. And then my grandmother, when we came to the States, the same thing. She would just sit with me and have me tell me stories, have me tell stories. My grandfather, the same thing. And one of the things I realized was like that is essentially what this book is. It's a telling and retelling of stories over and over again. And that is how we make, as writers, you and me, make sense of a world that is chaotic. I mean, that's how poets do it. That's how artists do it. The world itself, I think, feels so big and so you can't kind of get your head around it or your arms around it. And so I think my writer origin story is basically starts with those young moments of just trying to make sense of things that just cannot make sense to a child. And the only way that you can do that is by sitting down and telling the story as you know it, one way, which I did, which I try to relay in the book. But you tell the story one way, and then you come back and you find you are saying it again, and it changes. Like the way that you go about telling it changes, and it solves for something else. Does that answer your question? Does that make sense?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, just getting into I get it. It's a hard question to answer because it's always it's ongoing, it's developing, it's who you are, it's baked into who you are. Even when you have an email there from your mom who's correcting your grammar.
Oh my God.
In your email, it's just like, oh, that's a really funny grace note, and that tells everything you need to know about your mom and a little bit about your dynamic and everything, and probably something you're like, oh, come on, really? You're gonna nitpick 2 versus 2 here? It's a typo, Mom.
Oh my God, are you kidding me? It's, the great joke on her is that she passed away, and the daughter that didn't know grammar is now an editor and a writer.
So Neda, like a lot of times with these conversations, I like to bring the airliner down for a landing by asking guests for a recommendation of some kind to the listeners, and that can be anything from a brand of coffee to a pair of socks. It can be professional, personal. It can be both. So I'd extend that to you, Neda. What might you recommend to the listeners out there?
Well, can I recommend 2 quick things?
Oh, yeah. And it doesn't have to be quick. You can elaborate all you want.
All right. Well, I just finished the latest Sally Rooney, which I really enjoyed. It was a very quick read in like that best way. And people haven't read her, they should. Normal People was one of my favorite books of a few years ago. And I ended up making a friend on the plane because he loved it so much. So I highly recommend both Normal People and Beautiful World, Where Are You? But it's not even guilty because I take it very seriously, is reality television. And
all right.
Season 2 of Love is Blind is bonkers and insane. And it really brings people together because I've spent more time talking about the first however many episodes. I'm not sure listen, I am a connoisseur of really just I have a, in my family, in my household, we spend a lot of time watching dating shows. This is, I want to be very clear, very troubling in some ways. But if you want good television, if you want to see people making like what seems like pretty not, you know, like authentic reactions, this is it. And there is a very specific scene where people are sitting at a bar and tea is being spilled, and I have never, it's like watching the like a tanker crash, and I've never seen anything like it. My head was in my arms and I could not believe what I was watching. It is a highly recommended piece of television.
Well, it's great to have stuff of that nature that really, even if it's like, you know, trashy TV, to unplug from things and just to turn your brain off and just watch something like that. And it can be nourishing content, or it can just be something that is just there for pure entertainment, so you can just really veg and turn your brain off.
Oh, for sure. I mean, like, listen, this is not the Great British Bake Off, which is like a very comforting reality television program.
Right.
This is like I said, it's a lot. It asks a lot of us as human beings to watch the show, but it washes over me. It's been a hard work week, and I've just like fallen in. I've like sunk into my couch and let this show wash over me. So my recommendation is Trash.
Awesome. And I'd add a recommendation too, which is on your Twitter account, is to get a good look at your Twitter avatar picture. It is the best picture I think I've ever seen.
Oh, I thank you. I very much appreciate that. I love that picture.
Very nice. Well, Neda, the book's incredible. I burned through it over the weekend, and it was it was a treat and a treasure to read. So, but for the podcast audience, of course, if for people who might not be familiar with who you are and where to find your work, where can they find you online and get a little bit more familiar with you and your work?
Yeah, I write for Vice News. So if you head over to vicenews.com, you should watch us on Vice TV, on Showtime. I'm on Twitter at Neda, Neda_Semnani, Semnani. So follow me there. And my website is nedasemnani.com.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to a chance we get to do this again, Neda. And once again, thanks for the work and thanks for the time. This was wonderful.
Thanks for having me. This was so fun.
As is standard operating procedures, that was a toe-tapping good time in the mosh pit. That is CNF Pod. Check out They Said They Wanted Revolution by Neda Toloui-Semnani. Gives you some great U.S.-Iranian context that is pretty damn illuminating. Complicated shit, man, this world. The U.S. is like a bull in a china shop, only the china shop is Earth. As with anything above my pay grade, I'll stuff a sock in it because I don't know what I'm talking about. This is not a novel concept by any stretch, but this past week has been particularly frenetic at CNF Pod HQ. I'm spazzing out about this book proposal. It's coming along, but my tires spin quite a bit as I kind of don't know sometimes, all right, should I be doing the sample chapter now or trying to find a through line with the chapter outline, or how about my overview? Blah, blah, all that stuff. If you've written book proposals, you know what it's about. If you haven't, well, at some point or another, you'll deal with it in good luck. I do coaching, by the way. I'm keeping the pod machine in motion. My day job is what it is. I always find, myself, as Cal Newport might say, context shifting. Jumping from one reactive moment to the next. Email here, Twitter there, IG there, texting here, doodling over there, reading here. Oh shit, maybe I should meditate to calm my anxious brain. Well, fuck, that 10 minutes didn't work. Anyway, I've used this metaphor before. It's like I'm a frayed electrical wire just whipping around. Or maybe it's more like there's a frayed electrical wire just whipping around me and I'm trying to dodge it. And I think that's more it. It's more reactive in that sense. And I don't know what will happen if it actually made contact. And so maybe it's a shitty metaphor, but I think you kind of get the idea. So to address that, I've been doing this thing, time blocking, which isn't a novel concept. Ben Franklin famously did it. Peter Drucker did it, and then Cal Newport has popularized the idea with his deep work book, but his time block planner. I don't use his actual planner. I have too many things of that nature as is, notebooks and so forth. I just use a Field Notes notebook, and I draw the grids in it. The premise is you give every minute of the workday a job. You budget time, literally. For instance, today, and maybe I'll post this on the gram for shits and giggles, it's 6 to 7 is just like meditate, journal, and podcast stuff. And I'm still in that time block in this second for a few more minutes, so I'm still going. 7 to 8 is some book work. 8 to 9 is some more podcast stuff, probably transcripts and a little admin. From 9 to 11 is day job stuff, so morning meeting. I have to work on the Friday and Saturday page. There's another staff meeting from 11 to about 11:30. Noon to 1, I work on the Sunday page. From 1 to 2:30, I got to pick up letters at the office and go to the library. And then from 2 to 3, I got to work on something for the Salem newspaper, and then I'll end the day with some email. And I have some few things that I'll do in the evening, but I'm just going to stop there. And I color code my pod, writing, freelance work in green, day job in red. If things change, you pivot from the plan. You just draw more blocks to the side and X out the ones that are no longer relevant. I liken this to a head coach's call sheet, football coach. That color-coded thing you see the coaches refer to during the game, covering their mouths, etc. They go into the game with a plan for every situation. That said, they have to pivot based on what the other team is doing. Same goes for time blocking. The day can throw things at you and you can adjust. But you still have that initial plan. So what this really helps me with is decision fatigue. Instead of worrying about what to do with a certain 30-minute or 60-minute chunk, I'll just scribble in, 7 to 8, pod transcripts and admin. Done. That's it for that block. Nothing else. See it through, move on. Newport has a video about how he time blocks and the fundamentals of it on his website, which I found really helpful. I've watched it a few times over the few months as I move from one thing to the next because I can't stick with anything. I have the attention span of, me. Huh? I feel much more in control of my controllables this way. I'm sure you have your own systems, but if you're susceptible to even the most minute distractions and struggle with focus, you might want to give it a try, even if just for a few hours, say on a Sunday, like on a day you want to get some writing done, and you're putting a little pressure on yourself for this is my 3-hour block of the week where I actually get to work on my thing. You could say 7 to 8. Just your writing. 8 to 9, some research that maybe comes up as a result of the writing you did. And you're like, I need to fill in some holes. And then 9 to 10, maybe you read. Built into those blocks is like a little transition period, like maybe a 5 to 10 minute walk at the end of each block. That way you're not just shifting from one to the other without a breather. Give it a try. It's helping me a bit. My problem, as I already said, is that I'm very much a shiny new objects kind of dude. So I hope to stick with it. Hope it helps because it's hard out there. Everything is trying to compete for our attention, whether it's podcasts or social media, TV. We are under attack and bludgeoned by the almighty algorithm. So something to think about. In any case, CNFers, stay wild, and if you can do, interview. See ya.